our Pathways to Recovery and Resiliency Funding webinar series. So as a reminder, this series is meant to break down state and local funding opportunities to better help local governments and community partners navigate and access potential solutions for the challenges they're facing. As mentioned by Rick earlier, we do have some great speakers today. We have Mark Rudolph from CDPHE, who's going to speak about brownfields funding. And then we have Marguerite Harden, who's going to speak some more to the environmental health funding that we have in DOLA. So really looking forward to that. So we will go ahead and kick it off with Mark.
Great. Thank you, Shale. Appreciate it. And good morning to everybody. So Mark Rudolph, I'm the CDPHE Brownfields Coordinator and have a lot of new resources to be able to update you all on. Next slide, please. I think everybody's aware of a brownfield, but I just wanted to include a real brief definition to any property that is abandoned, idled, or underutilized due to the presence, keyword, or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Here are a couple pictures of some examples. Some of these may not have contamination, but they've been underutilized due to the presence or potential presence. Next slide, please. How they impact communities, various blighted appearances, decreased property values, tax bases, decreased environmental contamination, and they just basically impede economic growth. By revitalizing and cleaning up these brownfields, we can see improved environmental health and safety, a positive economic impact, and then general community revitalization based off of areas being cleaned up and more desire to be developing in those areas. Next slide, please. Resources that we're able to provide and some of our partner agencies, CDPHE and EPA provide information guidance services and funding for brownfields redevelopments to eligible parties. Eligible parties primarily being municipalities, nonprofits, joint ventures between private developers as well as the nonprofits or municipalities. The Colorado Department of Labor and Environment provides information for funding specific to oil, petroleum site cleanups, tank removals, and other cleanup work associated with that. Kansas State University, or KSU, is EPA's technical assistance provider, or TAB. They provide guidance and other EPA application support. And then the Colorado Brownfields Partnership, which is a contract that CDPHE has with community builders out of Glenwood Springs, but they are all over the state. We were able to provide free education, workshops, planning assistance, on-call coaching and advisory services, all free of charge to eligible parties. And for the most part, to anyone that has interest in redeveloping a brownfields redevelopment. They may not be eligible for other services, but certainly these initial discussions are we provide free of charge. Next slide, please. So our partnership and assistance, as I had said, no cost support to help these communities learn about brownfields, what they are, being able to enhance their capacity as a municipality to undertake projects, bringing stakeholders together to identify practical ways to get these projects moving forward via workshops, webinars, on-call coaching, other planning support, and all forms of technical assistance. Next slide. Colorado Brownfields Partnership support, like I said, the on-call coaching. Basically, it's just informal get-togethers to discuss community brownfield sites and options, sharing information to be able to dispel myths that, oh, it's not a Superfund site, and by undertaking this environmental liability on, you're going to be able to see other forms of economic growth in the community, and then able to provide step-by-step guidance from applications to cleanup and everything in between. Future planning assistance, identifying how cleaning up of these brownfields can advance various community goals, visioning and identifying actionable strategies, and then prioritizing sites for action-based cleanup based off of the community needs that then promotes other forms of growth in those communities. The state, we provide targeted brownfield assessments, which is either a phase 1 or a phase 2 to eligible applicants, community, not municipalities and nonprofit-owned sites. Local governments may apply on behalf of a private property where there's a clear public benefit. State staff and our contractor, we do all of the work at no cost to these applicants. Phase 1s include record search, visual surveys, and more of a history of the site that provides what the recommendations are for what's a phase 2, which includes sampling. And these TBAs meet all current ASTM and AAI standards. Next slide. So financing your brownfields project, to get to the meat of the bones here. Next slide. We have financial assistance in being able to provide state brownfields cleanup grants, which comes from our House Bill 1306, which is from the Hazardous Substance Response Fund. We have the Colorado Brownfields Revolving Loan Fund, and we also have a Colorado tax credit for remediation of contaminated lands. We also are able to provide support with other federal and other resources that are available. We keep tabs on that and able to provide direction to applicants. Next slide. Here's a brief knockdown of comparisons between EPA and state resources that are available. Both EPA and the state provide TBAs, phase 1s and phase 2s. Generally, from the application acceptance to the time you get a report, it's anywhere from 1 to 3 months. Sometimes, depending on the size of the site, it could be a little bit more. Cleanup grants vary greatly. Generally, the state max cleanup grants around $250,000, while EPAs can go up to $2 million. The state has an open rolling deadline until the funds are expended, where EPA only has an application window in the fall of every year. The state resources are great for smaller single sites, less complex applications, and only in Colorado. The EPA sites are for larger multi-state efforts, and Colorado applicants are competing against all of Region 8, which is Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Next slide, please. So here's a couple case studies that we have. The Durango Powerhouse Science Center is a former, next slide. It was a former coal-fired power plant, the oldest one for AC current in the world, with a very unique architectural style. The city of Durango purchased it in the 1990s, and at that point in time, it sat defunct until the Children's Museum of Durango grew out of their space in 2002 and made a proposal to the city of Durango for a new location. Next slide. The issues at hand is we had uranium mill tailings that had been underlain Highway 550 right behind the building, that had weeped out of the drainage holes from the CDOT retaining wall across the site. There was mercury contamination and various different polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from the use of coal and coal burned refuse. The building was covered with asbestos, and there was an upgradient petroleum plume that came underneath the building. Next slide. So assistance in financing, CDPHE, this was a voluntary cleanup site where they voluntarily came in and put together a plan to address the environmental issues, to be able to redevelop it as a children's museum. This happened a little while ago. It would have been a lot more expensive than $135,000, but we funded $135,000 to basically clean up the PAH and mercury contamination. There was a $90,000 from state funds for the removal of asbestos, and just asbestos. $135,000 was for the contaminated soil. So that's a mistake on the slide. $2 million in public and private donations for general site rehab. Local firms donated time, labor, materials to the undertaking here. Next slide. And so what we have here is an operating children's museum. Basically, voluntary cleanup sites are cleaned up to a risk-based cleanup level. And with this being a children's museum, technically it's a commercial entity, but we had this cleaned up to a residential standard because kids were going to be there. So we took a more conservative approach to be able to have this building house kids and other people for community gatherings or whatnot. Next slide, please. So total investment in the building was about $4 million. And we've seen approximately 2.1 million annually and created 32 full-time jobs with just this redevelopment of the Children's Museum. Now, what it has done though is spurred on other economic growth and interest in that whole river corridor right off of the downtown Main Street area. Next slide. Silverton Anvil Mountain, next slide. This was the location of the former Martha Rose Walsh smelter site. It was a brief operating smelter in the town of Silverton that resulted in various different forms of waste, arsenic, lead, was ore crushing, and then they smelted the ore on site, coal blast furnace as well. It was identified as a location for affordable housing needs in Silverton, which is in high demand with people buying second homes, et cetera, in the small mountain town with very limited real estate opportunities within the town boundary. Next slide. So the challenge there was we had lead, cadmium, barium, and arsenic across the site that were all exceeded greatly the residential cleanup criteria. Next slide. Various different funding sources, CDPHE provided funding as well as an EPA brownfields grant and other grants that you can see here. In the effort to expedite this, I'll take any questions afterwards. I mean, at the end of the Q&A. Next slide. And so what we've been able to accomplish with this cleanup are 12 affordable rental units, 8 are restricted by income, 24 single family affordable market rate homes. All of these properties have a requirement that you have to live in San Juan County, which is pretty limited real estate and the problem people working 2, 3, sometimes 4 jobs and not being able to make ends meet with the cost of rent in town. So this has really greatly improved a local workforce housing. And I think that, oh, here we go, last one. Total new investments just shy of $4 million, land and tax values up to 1.32 million, created 6 full-time jobs. And one of the metrics that I don't have in there are what level of workforce housing that's occupied currently and what the tax revenue is from those jobs that are in Silverton and San Juan County. I think that might be my last one. There's my contact info and happy to take Q&A at the end of the webinar of the hour. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'll just jump right in here. My name is Marguerite Harden. I'm with the Colorado Resiliency Office, and I'm the local resiliency manager. So I work with local governments across the state on building their resiliency. Today, I'm going to go over 4 EIAF set-asides. If you don't know what EIAF is, I would be surprised, but it's the Energy and Mineral Impact Assistance Fund that is managed out of DOLA, which I will go into on the next slide. Great. So here is a landing page for the Energy and Mineral Impact Assistance Fund. This fund is managed by DOLA again and is created through severance and has some volatile ups and downs in terms of how much funding is available. And what the state has done is set aside a number of initiatives, the 4 that you see here, starting with Climate Resilience Challenge over to Main Street Live initiative. And these are eligible projects within EIAF generally, but by setting aside some of the funding for these initiatives, we've ensured that these priority investment areas are given their funding, as well as we're increasing the award opportunities for these initiatives, and we're reducing the match compared to the traditional EIAF fund. So each of these set-asides has nuances on things like the amount of funding available, how long that funding is available, what the max award is, and how much match is required. But all of these funds have what you see here in the blue text, that the application will open on June 30th of 2023, along with the normal EIAF funding cycle. And all of these funds, as usual, also require you to contact and work with your DOLA regional manager before applying. So you'll see this blue text repeated on some of the next slides, where I will jump into each of these initiatives individually. So if you could just advance, this animation just shows the order I'll be going over them, starting with the broadband initiative. And I'm going to end with a climate resilience challenge, because this climate resilience challenge relates to the theme of this webinar on environmental projects and opportunities. So I'll be doing a deeper dive on the climate resilience challenge. So next slide. Starting off with this broadband planning and infrastructure initiative. This is the only initiative that is not new this year. It has been around for about 5 years, and there's $5 million available through the end of next fiscal year for the state, so June 30th of 2024. You can request up to $1 million. The match requirements you can see here, and really this fund can go towards planning grants that have a regional, multi-jurisdictional approach, as well as middle mile infrastructure grants. And there's really a focus here on looping community anchor institution to create a local network, having inclusion in local, regional, or multi-county plans. So we want to be able to see that this is a priority for the region. In planning documents, it allows for public safety, and it follows local, state, federal, and tribal permitting requirements. And again, there's that blue text. Next slide. And I'll just go over briefly this More Housing Now and Land Use Initiative. This is a new set aside, and really it's working towards more and efficient land use actions that leads to more affordable housing. So 20 million is available through 2026. You can request up to 2 million, and you can see those match requirements here. So the land use and other strategies you can see on this set aside website. It really, there's a number of priority strategies that your local government can implement. You can see here, it's really for publicly owned infrastructure and streetscapes. There's land use strategy adoption, regional housing needs assessments. It's the implementation or planning for that, and shared housing analysis and agreements, and of course the fiscal health and greenhouse gas reduction land use strategy as well. So this set aside is different but related to what you may already be aware of outside of the EIAF program, the Strong Communities Grant Program. So it's not to be confused with that. It was the Strong Communities Grant Program was set up by House Bill 22-1304 and also managed within DOLA's Community Development Office. I just dropped the link in the chat for this program. It also relates to land use best practices, smart growth, but really focuses on that infill development, also contributing to more affordable housing. So you just might, if you're thinking about going after this fund, you might just want to compare with the Strong Communities Grant Program and make sure you're pursuing the appropriate opportunity. Next slide. Great. So this third set aside, the Main Street Live Livability Investments for Vibrant Economies, is also a new set aside. 17.5 million available through 2026. You can request up to 1.5 million. And this invests in downtown public infrastructure and facilities. So you may be aware of the Main Street program that we have out of the Community Development Office here at DOLA. This is open to non-Main Street communities and really is meant to invest in downtowns, renewable energy, affordable housing, building codes, age-friendly amenities, improving livability and vibrancy of your downtown. So that's really exciting. You can learn more on the website. So with that, I will jump into a deeper dive on this next slide of the Climate Resilience Challenge. So the fourth of these 4 set-asides of the EIAF program. And notably, this Climate Resilience Challenge is an outgrowth from what was previously offered under EIAF as a set-aside called the Renewable Energy Funding, or Renew funding. And that funding focused really only on climate mitigation. This new Climate Resilience Challenge Fund is really integrating climate mitigation as well as climate adaptation. As you can see from the image here on this slide, you have some examples of the mitigation, which reduces greenhouse gases on the left, that climate adaptation, which can be a number of ways that we're responding to the impacts of climate change. And there's, of course, an overlap that does both those mitigation and adaptation goals. So the purpose of this fund is really to integrate those mitigation and adaptation projects into really big and bold projects that advance multiple objectives within your local government. And we have funding both for planning for these types of projects in your local community, as well as implementation that will mitigate and adapt to a changing climate. So on this next slide, I provide a big picture overview of the funding. And you can see for this fund, we have 20 million over the next 3 years. The max award is 5 million. And so there could be just a few big projects funded out of this fund. We really want you to think big. This is a challenge. We're excited about it. And this first round of application again opens on June 30th and follows the EIAF cycle. And again, you're required to reach out to your DOLA regional manager, but there's a reduced match for these both planning and implementation grants. And we are looking forward to, rolling this out. I have a bit more guidance as to what we are looking for. And that we can jump into the next slide, the planning grants specifically. So there are a lot of communities here within Colorado that already have climate action plans. And I'll drop a list into the chat that we are tracking a number of these, non-exhaustive. I'm sure there's some that we're missing. But a lot of these plans really just might relate to mitigating climate change. What we're looking for with these planning grants under the Climate Resilience Challenge are for you to have at least one, or it could be multiple plans that address the mitigation of climate change, the adaptation to climate change, as well as how you're going to reduce climate-related risks, impacts, and vulnerabilities, including social vulnerabilities. So in order to apply for the implementation grants, which I'll go into further detail on the next slide, you do need to have these plans already within your jurisdiction. If you're a municipality, you can have it at the more county level, but you are required to do these 3 things in blue, which you can see repeated again on this next slide about implementation grants. So for the implementation grants, again, you're required to have these sorts of climate resilience or action plans. Those plans can't be older than 5 years old, and we're looking for projects that have multi-objectives. So I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. But we're also looking for these projects to holistically address some of the most vulnerable, high-risk vulnerabilities in your region. So we want to see that in your plan, you have highlighted these as high risk and that these are addressing those risks. And also we require these implementation projects to incorporate IDEA, or inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, which I'll also go into on my next slides. So what do we mean by multi-objective projects? If we jump ahead one slide, again, these projects must mitigate, adapt to, and reduce vulnerabilities around climate change. And here I've laid out how we think here at the Colorado Resiliency Office about the holistic interties between our sectors in the image in the bottom right, and how climate change is really a force multiplier of a lot of the impacts that these sectors are going to be facing. And we at the state have these 6 state resiliency priorities that you see here, which are outlined in our Colorado Resiliency Framework or our 5-year plan. And we expect that, you know, not all 6 of these priorities might be your priorities at your local level, but we want to see in your climate plan that you have your own priorities laid out for your jurisdiction, and that your proposed project is relating to those. And so going on to the next slide, doing a little bit more information on how we would like these projects to advance IDEA. We want to see that you understand who within your community is the most vulnerable to climate disruptions. And there are a lot of data tools out there. Colorado EnviroScreen is one of them that I've linked here, but that also includes layers related to Justice 40, which is the federal vulnerabilities mapping tool. And there's, you know, other definitions that are included in this mapping tool, or perhaps your own at the local government level. And so not only do we want to see that you understand who is most vulnerable, we also want to see in your planning efforts how this project will reduce those vulnerabilities. So there's that intertie between who is vulnerable and how this is reducing those vulnerabilities. And so on the next slides, I just have some examples of multi-objective projects that also incorporate IDEA. And this first one on the left, we hosted a webinar as part of our climate webinar series last week on this Alta Verde net zero workforce community housing. So this housing project in Breckenridge actually did receive EIF funding, and it is now operational, and they're expanding it, but it really incorporates energy efficiency, solar PV, transit-oriented development, affordable workforce housing, which has that IDEA focus, green infrastructure, and a lot of land use planning that meets that kind of high priority project for this region, for Breckenridge's priorities, and does that multi-objective approach. So that is one great example. And again, maybe we can link to that webinar series in our chat so that you can do a deeper dive in here directly from Breckenridge on how they rolled out that project. Another example is agrivoltaics. So Jack Solar Garden is one example out in Longmont that integrates that mitigation side, the solar photovoltaics, as well as the adaptation side of providing locally grown food and agriculture to the local community. They also have an IDEA sort of approach to some of their work. So they serve artists and students. Low-income households receive 2% of the electricity by donation from what is produced out of these photovoltaics. And so they are supporting the local agriculture, pollinators. It's a less water intensive design. You know, it's really taking that holistic approach that we're looking for in these projects. And there's also even a workforce development and farmer training aspect to this project. So a really good example of some multi-objective approach to this, that, you know, that could be a good example of something that could be proposed for the Climate Resilience Challenge. Next slide. We at the Resiliency Office have a goal of really fostering more resilience hubs within the region. And we have a resources document that can provide more information for you if you're interested in this in your community as to what is a resiliency hub and what that can look like for your community. But really, it is meant to serve the community, serve especially the IDEA community. It could integrate renewables, qualifying it for having that climate mitigation aspect in the project. It could be a microgrid, which we also have other funding for, but you know, that could be a part of this proposal of, you know, where a microgrid would allow this this facility to provide energy and stay on even if the larger grid or the utility went down for some reason through some sort of a backup energy source such as a battery. And at times these resilience hubs can serve as an emergency operations center as well. And so we can link to more information on that. But that is another really great example of a project that might be eligible for the challenge. And here in the right column, I link to the Poudre River Whitewater Park, which is in Fort Collins. It is a really great example of a multi-objective project. It has a lot of co-benefits. You can see here, it offers recreation, economic development, reduced flood risk, and natural habitat. There's a lot of climate adaptation aspects to this project, but I do list it here, just it wouldn't actually be eligible for the challenge because it does not, as it stands, reduce greenhouse gases or necessarily, I mean, perhaps it does serve the IDA communities, but looking at it here, it may not. So we would be interested in projects like this, but we'd really want to work with the applicant to think about, is there a facility that could have renewable energy on it nearby, or is there micro hydro component that could be added to this that reduces those greenhouse gases? And also, how is this serving the most vulnerable communities within Fort Collins? So just to get your wheels turning as to some other projects and other ways you can think about proposals for this grant. So on this next slide, we do just want to re-emphasize that we want to challenge you to think really big. What does resilience mean to your community? We want these to be, while I like providing examples, we want you to come up with what will serve your community best. And we're really excited to see what you can come up with. We have some more guidance that can hopefully provide some more inspiration to you. And again, you can find out more on the EIAF website. So with that, on my last slide, I just have the contact information for myself as well as others in the CRO that are forwarding this challenge. And of course, your DOLR, in addition to your DOLR regional manager who can be accessible to you. So with that, I will end. Happy to provide answers or Q&A.
All right, I'll go ahead and get started with Q&A. And this is Ann Miller from the Colorado Resiliency Office. And we have one question. This is for Mark Rudolph. Is there any acquisition funding available to purchase sites to aid brownfield cleanup?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ann. So unfortunately, we do not have any acquisition funding for these types of sites. Depending on the state of disrepair or level of disrepair contamination present, we encourage the local community to work with the property owner to highlight the environmental liabilities associated and then the resultant property value. Oftentimes, once the property owner is aware that the site property value may be upside down, they're able to make a donation of the property. Other times we've had communities take title to the property via eminent domain, or other times there's a tax default that results in transfer of the deed to the local municipality. But unfortunately, we do not have acquisition funding. The funding that we have is strictly related to environmental cleanup.
Thank you, Mark. Please feel free to type any questions for Marguerite or to Mark or anyone else who spoke today in the chat or Q&A. And also want to just thank our presenters for, again, a very informative funding information and opportunities for local governments and communities. All right, not seeing any additional questions coming in right now.
Hey, Ann, I think there's a couple more questions in the Q&A thing that I'm seeing.
Thank you. Yep, just saw something. Thank you. So yeah, we've got a question for Marguerite on what kind of local entities can apply for the resiliency grants?
Sure. So we are following the EIAF guidelines, which we can drop into the chat, but it is local governments, municipalities, counties, special districts, I believe. And I think that covers it.
So I'm seeing, oh, I'm sorry. There were a couple questions from Margot and then one from Craig. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you. Go.
Yes.
I'm for some reason not seeing those. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and Margot Schrift had said, I know that there has been an initiative to go back to completed sites in other EPA regions to assess for climate resilience. When you remediate and revitalize you consider climate change projections or just current conditions? For example, if hazardous soils are capped, considering flooding. And unfortunately, we are currently just looking at current conditions. We do take into account, if a site is located within a floodplain, that the best use of the property would be in cleaning it up to pull that material out of the floodplain and not just capping it in place. But I don't think that necessarily addresses your question entirely. And then Craig had a question. We have a community that has gone through cleanup of blighted private properties. What would be their next step? And I'm not sure, Craig, if you are referring to on the redevelopment side or additional cleanup that might be needed. Oftentimes, when the blighted property, the property is cleaned up and the building has gone through demolition. And it becomes a building ready site. And so that may be a question I defer to Dola.
Okay, I'm going to continue on. If somebody wants to respond to that, give you a little thought from Dola, but I'm going to, given time, we do have some more questions coming in. So I'm going to continue on with a question for Margot. For the Climate Resilience Challenge, what is the amount of consulting you can give to applicants who are trying to plan a big project? Marguerite?
Sure. So for planning grants, if that's what you're saying, they can all go towards a consultant, and there is no max award set aside for planning grants. And so that project should really be planned already if you are applying for an implementation grant. I'm sure an implementation grant could have a set aside for consultants to help manage the project. But yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm aware of a max percentage of consultants. We can follow up after the call in the Q&A log for if we have any other details.
Marguerite, another question for you. Are there any climate resiliency planning grants for developing green infrastructure or nature-based solutions?
Sure. I think green infrastructure and nature-based solutions are a really great element to have as part of the Climate Resilience Challenge implementation grants. Some green infrastructure can actually reduce greenhouse gases if it's a green roof and there's energy efficiency there. And of course, it provides climate adaptation as well because it can reduce flooding and runoff. So green infrastructure and nature-based solutions would be a great element to any Climate Resilience Challenge proposal.